Fear isn't just a reaction, it's a language, coded in symbols, instincts, and subconscious beliefs. It whispers in the dark corners of our minds, not just warning us of danger, but questioning our identity, our values, our direction. Most of us treat fear as something to overcome, erase, or medicate. But what if that's a mistake? What if fear isn't our enemy, but our instructor? In this video, we'll explore the deeper anatomy of fear, not through pop psychology, but through the brutal, brilliant insights of 5 towering minds, including Carl Jung, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Arthur Schopenhauer. Each faced fear, not just as individuals, but as thinkers confronting the raw edge of human existence. And each came away with a radically different way of seeing it. Freedom doesn't begin where fear ends. It begins when you realize that fear was never a threat, but rather a message. This isn't a motivational speech. It's a philosophical autopsy of fear, of suffering, and of what it means to transform dread into direction. By the end of this video, you won't seek to ignore fear or rise above it. Instead, you'll be challenged to decode it, absorb it, and maybe even walk through it. So what is fear, really? At first glance, it's a survival mechanism, an ancient alarm system that narrows the senses and floods the body with adrenaline. But modern fear isn't just about avoiding predators or cliffs. It's also about rejection, meaninglessness, failure, mortality. It's existential. And that makes it harder to escape, because it's not just the outside world, it's in our heads. Fear begins in the body, but metastasizes in the mind. It becomes symbolic. It builds futures that haven't happened. It wears masks, anxiety, avoidance, hesitation. The more intelligent the person, the more sophisticated the disguise. Fear can even mimic reason, crafting what feels like insight but functions as a cage. Michel de Montaigne saw this clearly when he said, "A man who fears suffering is already suffering from what he fears." Fear doubles our pain. It builds recursive layers: fear of pain, fear of fear, fear of the self that fears. Arthur Schopenhauer called this the echo of the will, the blind, insatiable drive that animates all life. For him, fear was suffering in advance. Conscious beings suffer because they can imagine what might go wrong and dread it. But Nietzsche reframed this entirely. Fear for him was resistance, resistance to growth. It signals that something powerful is demanding to emerge. "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how," he wrote. But if fear obscures the why, the how becomes intolerable. Fear is tension between who we are and who we could be. The self seeks expansion. The ego clings to stability. Fear is the friction between the two. Carl Jung saw this as a threshold. To him, fear was not pathology. It was invitation. It marked the emergence of the shadow, the unconscious parts of the self demanding integration. Fear, then, is sacred. It points toward individuation. Fear is both signal and distortion. It can protect or imprison. It's not something to be erased, but something to be understood. Philosophy doesn't destroy fear, it decodes it. Because perhaps the goal isn't to stop being afraid, it's to let fear speak, without letting it decide. To understand the depth of fear, we must begin where hope is scarce. With Arthur Schopenhauer, the bleak architect of philosophical pessimism. Schopenhauer didn't sugarcoat the human condition. He believed that behind everything we do lies an unconscious, insatiable force he called the will, a blind striving that animates all life, from the growing plant to the desiring human. It doesn't think, it doesn't plan, it only wants, and never stops wanting. And this, Schopenhauer argued, is the root of suffering. Fear, in this worldview, is not some evolutionary error. It's a rational response to existence itself. We are conscious organisms cursed with the ability to reflect on a world driven by irrational forces. We see the chaos behind the curtain. We sense that no matter how much we achieve, the will remains unsatisfied. And we fear its grip, because it never lets go. To Schopenhauer, life is suffering, not by accident, but by design. Every moment of joy is fleeting. Every desire fulfilled spawns new ones. Fear becomes a kind of preemptive grief, a recognition that nothing we cling to will last. Every love will fade. Every body will decay. Every ambition eventually collapses into silence. This is why he saw human consciousness as a curse. Animals act out the will without knowing it. But we know. We can imagine our own death. We can anticipate loss. We suffer not only in the moment, but in advance. We fear not just the pain that is, but the pain that might be. And yet Schopenhauer didn't advocate despair. He offered a paradoxical form of liberation. He believed that by seeing through the illusion, by recognizing the nature of the will, we could distance ourselves from it. Not through control, but through detachment. Art, music, philosophy, and ascetic contemplation offered glimpses of freedom. Moments where the will fell silent and something deeper emerged. Not pleasure, but peace. In this silence, fear softens, not because the world changes, but because our stance toward it does. For Schopenhauer, fear can't be conquered, but it can be understood. And sometimes understanding is enough. If Schopenhauer saw fear as the echo of suffering, Nietzsche turned the whole structure upside down. Where his predecessor saw a world governed by an inescapable will, Nietzsche saw a canvas, raw, painful, yes, but also fertile. For Nietzsche, fear wasn't merely a warning of pain to come. It was evidence that something meaningful was at stake. Fear, to Nietzsche, is not weakness. It is friction, the heat generated by the self as it rubs against the possibility of transformation. We fear not because we are fragile, but because we are standing at the edge of something vast. Become who you are, he said, not as comfort, but as provocation. Because to become who you are, you must first shatter who you were. Where Schopenhauer saw the will as something to be quieted, Nietzsche saw a different force, the will to power. Not domination, but self-overcoming. The desire to grow beyond our limitations, to affirm life even in its brutality. Fear, in this sense, is the body's way of announcing that we are being called to act, to risk, to evolve. This is why Nietzsche admired the tragic hero. Not the one who avoids suffering, but the one who embraces it for the sake of becoming more. The higher you aim, the more fear you encounter. Not because the goal is wrong, but because your current self isn't ready, yet. Fear becomes a compass, pointing toward the precise place where your growth is possible. And this is where Nietzsche's genius reveals itself. He doesn't ask us to escape fear. He dares us to dance with it, to use it, to transmute it. His entire philosophy is a dare. Can you bear the weight of becoming? Can you endure the fear that change demands? And not just endure it, but affirm it. Because the fire you fear is also the fire that forges. To Nietzsche, fear was not the enemy. Fear was the evidence that life still has something to demand of you. Something difficult, something sacred, something necessary. And in walking toward that fire, even trembling, you begin the alchemy of becoming. Carl Jung didn't see fear as a glitch in the psyche. He saw it as a message from the parts of ourselves we refuse to see. Where Nietzsche challenged us to embrace fear as a transformative force, Jung takes us deeper, into the hidden chambers of the self, where fear isn't just a reaction but a mirror, a reflection of all that we've repressed, denied, or buried. He called it the shadow, the unconscious counterpart to the ego. And fear, in Jung's view, is often the echo of the shadow knocking. Fear shows up most violently when we encounter something within or outside ourselves that contradicts the story we tell about who we are. The polished image, the socially acceptable mask. Jung believed that much of our suffering arises not from external threats, but from our refusal to integrate the disowned parts of ourselves. That's why confronting fear is never just about the surface fear. It's about what that fear symbolizes: vulnerability, inadequacy, rage, desire, truth. To Jung, fear is a threshold experience, an initiation into the unknown realms of the psyche. When we feel the quickening of anxiety before a decision, or the terror of exposure and vulnerability, or the dread of stepping into a new role or truth, it's not just discomfort. It's a sign that we are brushing against the boundaries of our current self-concept. And if we have the courage to step through that boundary, we enter the process he called individuation, the gradual alignment of the conscious and unconscious, the known and the hidden, the ego and the shadow. But this isn't a gentle journey. Jung was clear. The path to wholeness is lined with dragons. And those dragons are often just the shapes our deepest fears take. They seem monstrous because they are powerful, and because they carry the potential to transform us if faced. The more we deny the shadow, the more distorted it becomes. It leaks out in projections, paranoia, aggression. But when we turn to face it, something extraordinary happens. We reclaim parts of ourselves that we thought we had to disown to survive. Fear, then, is not the enemy. It is the invitation. It signals where the unconscious is trying to break through. It tells us, here lies your next integration. Here lies your next self. The goal isn't to extinguish fear. That would be to flatten the psyche, to live in delusion. The goal is to make fear conscious, to listen to its voice without being ruled by it, to see what it's pointing to within. Because as Jung wrote, that which we need the most will be found where we least want to look. And fear, raw, unedited, unapologetic, is the guide that leads us to the doorway. If Nietzsche asked us to stride into the flames and Jung beckoned us into the cavern of the unconscious, then Michel de Montaigne invites us, quite simply, to pull up a chair, pour a glass of wine, and talk with our fear as an old acquaintance. Writing in his tower in 16th century France while civil wars raged outside, Montaigne invented a literary form, the essay, whose very name, from essayer, to try, reveals his method: exploration over declaration, candor over certainty. The genius of Montaigne's stance was to shift fear from the realm of cosmic struggle into the space of ordinary daily life, where it can be observed, teased, even gently mocked. Consider his striking admission: "The thing in the world I am most afraid of is fear." Instead of armoring himself with stoic invulnerability, he exposes his nerves, and by naming them, deflates them. He understood that fear multiplies in secrecy, acknowledgement shrinks it. So he writes conversationally about toothaches, falling off horses, the death of children, his own bouts of melancholy. In doing so, he normalizes fear, neither glorifying nor pathologizing it, but treating it as a weather pattern of the mind, real, sometimes violent, always passing. Where Schopenhauer counseled detachment and Nietzsche thundered, "Become," Montaigne simply practiced being. Fear, he thought, is less an obstacle to heroic transcendence than a condition to be integrated into the texture of everyday experience. By cultivating intellectual humility, his famous motto was "Que sais-je?", meaning "what do I know?" He disarms the perfectionism that often hides behind fear. If certainty is impossible, then failure is not catastrophe. It's evidence that we are alive and learning. Montaigne also prescribed familiarity as medicine. He recommended rehearsing worst-case scenarios in the imagination, not to catastrophize, but to grow accustomed to them until their sting is dulled. Today we'd call this exposure therapy. Likewise, his relentless self-inquiry foreshadows modern journaling. By translating amorphous dread into ink, we convert sensation into object, something that can be read, revised, laughed at. Yet Montaigne is no naive optimist. He records plagues, massacres, personal grief, and acknowledges that courage sometimes falters. But precisely there, in the gap between his ideals and his admitted failures, he models a humane realism. Fear may unseat us, yet we can remount. We can return to the page, the conversation, the task, refusing to let one moment of terror harden into a life strategy. Essentially, the Montaignean art of living with fear looks like this. 1. Name it aloud. Vagueness empowers anxiety. Specificity limits it. 2. Write it down. Externalize, reread, and watch its drama shrink. 3. Share it socially. Conversation converts private monsters into communal stories. 4. Laugh when possible. Humor is intellectual judo. It redirects fear's momentum. 5. Remain curious. Ask, what can this fear teach? Not, how do I erase it? By treating fear as a lifelong companion rather than a dragon to slay, Montaigne frees us from the exhausting need to appear fearless. He shows that the gentle acceptance of vulnerability can coexist with a vibrant, engaged life, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply to keep turning the page, even when our hands tremble. When fear reaches its terminal depth, when survival itself seems stripped of dignity or logic, what remains? Viktor Frankl, neurologist, psychiatrist, Holocaust survivor, and founder of logotherapy, offers a response that is neither naive nor nihilistic. Meaning. Not comfort, not safety, not power, but meaning. Frankl's insights were forged not in theory, but in the crucible of Auschwitz. While other existentialists speculated from cafes or lecture halls, Frankl wrote his seminal work entitled Man's Search for Meaning, partly in his mind while enduring starvation, degradation, and the systematic dehumanization of the camps. Their fear was not hypothetical. It was constant, atmospheric. Yet Frankl observed something quietly astonishing. Those who could locate a purpose beyond themselves, even in that living hell, were more psychologically resilient than those who could not. Frankl reframed the central human question. Instead of asking, "What can I expect from life?" he asked, "What does life expect from me?" That inversion turns fear inside out. Fear, especially existential fear, often stems from the perception that life is senseless, that suffering is random, and that we are powerless. But when suffering is integrated into a meaningful narrative, when it becomes part of a task, a mission, a sacrifice, then fear can be endured, even transcended. Logotherapy, Frankl's psychotherapeutic model, is built on the idea that man is primarily driven by a striving to find meaning in his life. That drive is stronger than Freud's will to pleasure or to Alfred Adler's will to power. It is the will to meaning. When this will is thwarted, the individual is not merely bored or directionless. He becomes vulnerable to anxiety, depression, despair, and paralysis by fear. Frankl called this phenomenon the existential vacuum, an inner emptiness where fear thrives. In modern life, it often manifests as neurosis, addiction, or what he called the Sunday neurosis, the dread that surfaces when distractions fade and the silence of purposelessness echoes. To counter this, Frankl proposed 3 avenues to meaning. 1. Creative work, what we give to the world. 2. Experiential encounters, what we receive from life, love, art, nature. 3. Attitude toward unavoidable suffering, how we choose to suffer when we must. The third is particularly profound. Frankl emphasized that even when every external freedom is stripped away, we retain the last of the human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That inner stance, he argued, is untouchable, and in that sovereignty lies the death of fear's dominion. He gives the example of fellow inmates who shared their last piece of bread or comforted others despite their own anguish. These were not acts of self-interest or delusion. They were manifestations of meaning, deliberate affirmations that even in horror, one can remain human. And humanity, for Frankl, is not destroyed by fear, but is defined by how we respond to it. This reframing transforms fear from a stop sign into a signal. The presence of fear often means that something meaningful is at stake, rather than flee from it. Frankl invites us to examine what fear reveals about our deepest values. What am I afraid to lose? What do I feel unworthy of pursuing? What would I suffer for? These are not rhetorical questions. They are gateways to purpose. Importantly, Frankl does not suggest that fear disappears in the presence of meaning. Rather, it is put in its place. Meaning gives us a context larger than the fear, a why that can carry us through the how, echoing Nietzsche's maxim he frequently cited. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. Frankl's wisdom dismantles the modern obsession with fearlessness. He does not glorify suffering, but he affirms its transformative potential if aligned with a purpose. His legacy is not a blueprint for avoiding fear, but a mirror that asks us, what am I living for? Because if fear is the void, meaning is the bridge. And when we walk that bridge, even trembling, we are already transcending. After all the theory, anguish, and reflection from minds like Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Jung, Montaigne, and Frankl, we return to the ordinary, to the modern self waking up with a stomach full of dread, an inbox full of expectations, and a heart unsure of its own strength. What do we do with fear? We've seen that fear is not merely an enemy to be vanquished. It is a messenger, a mirror, a test. But to transform fear, to turn it into freedom, we must move from understanding to action. This is not about erasing fear. It is about performing alchemy. The conversion of psychic led into psychological gold. That alchemy has 3 stages: awareness, confrontation, and integration. Stage 1, awareness. Name the demon. Fear thrives in vagueness. When we don't name it, it multiplies. It grows tendrils, attaches itself to unrelated domains, and shapes our behavior from the shadows. But when we name it, when we say, I am afraid of rejection, or I am terrified I'll never be enough, we begin to dissolve its spell. Awareness begins with radical honesty. Nietzsche understood this. He believed that truth, no matter how brutal, was always preferable to illusion. To live courageously, he said, was to confront the abyss without flinching. And Jung echoed this through the process of individuation. Only when we become aware of our shadow, our unconscious fears, desires, and contradictions, can we begin to integrate them. Without this awareness, we remain possessed by fear's hidden forms: procrastination, perfectionism, emotional paralysis. Stage 2, confrontation. Step toward the fire. Fear loses power when we approach it. Not blindly, not recklessly, but deliberately, in small acts of defiance. This is the Montaignian art of living with fear, not waiting for fear to disappear before we act, but learning to act with it. Imagine the conversation you've avoided for months, the project you're scared to start, the truth you're scared to speak. Every time you take a step toward it, however small, you reclaim a piece of your agency. Frankl wrote that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the ability to choose one's response within it. So the goal is not to live without fear, but to move in spite of it. To rehearse courage in micro moments until it becomes a way of being. Even Schopenhauer, despite his pessimism, left us with this clue. We may not control the will, but we can adopt a stance of quiet resistance to its chaos. Choosing meaning over instinct, value over comfort, is itself an act of confrontation. Stage 3. Integration. Make fear a teacher. What if we stopped asking, how do I eliminate fear, and started asking, what is fear trying to teach me? That's the shift. Integration doesn't mean taming fear. It means aligning with its deeper intelligence. Fear often arises where something sacred lives. Your calling, your values, your potential. Jung believed that the symbols in our unconscious, dreams, fantasies, even fears, are messages from the self, pointing us toward wholeness. So we stop running. We sit with the fear. We listen. And when we do, we often find beneath it a demand to grow. Think of fear as a threshold. On one side, your current self. On the other, your possible self. The greater the fear, the more meaningful the threshold. That's why we resist. That's also why we must cross it. This is the deeper form of courage. Not bravado, not denial, but the willingness to suffer consciously for the sake of becoming more fully yourself. Nietzsche called this the path of the overman, a person who transforms pain into power, fear into fire. Montaigne called it philosophy lived in the bones. Frankl called it the spiritual freedom that remains even when all else is taken. Jung called it individuation, the unification of the conscious and unconscious into a cohesive self. And we call it freedom. Not the freedom sold by lifestyle brands or political slogans, but the internal, unshakable freedom of a person who no longer needs fear to rule them. It is not given. It is forged, in choice, in suffering, in meaning, and perhaps most importantly, in love. Because when we learn to hold our own fear with compassion, we begin to extend that compassion outward. What once imprisoned us becomes the key to empathy, and in that, the personal becomes universal. So the next time fear rises, don't run. Pause. Name it. Step toward it. Ask what it wants to show you. And then, walk forward anyway. That is how fear becomes fuel. That is how suffering becomes signal. That is how we turn fear into freedom. Fear is not the enemy. It is the doorway. It shows us where we are not yet free, where we have deferred our becoming, postponed our truth, denied our potential. And like all great forces in the psyche, it offers two paths, suppression or transformation. The thinkers we've explored, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Jung, Montaigne, and Frankl, each faced fear in his own way. Some saw it as a shadow to wrestle with, others as a signal to reframe. But all agreed, fear is not a reason to stop living. It is a reason to live more deliberately. To run from fear is to build a life in retreat. To walk toward it is to build a life of expansion. That's the alchemy. That's the secret. We don't become fearless. We become familiar. Familiar with the terrain of our own minds. Familiar with the patterns of avoidance. Familiar with the price of playing small. And in that familiarity, we discover something extraordinary. Not the absence of fear, but the presence of courage. And courage is what transforms fear into freedom. Thank you for walking this road with me tonight. Until next time, remember, fear is not your foe, but your frontier. Face it, feel it, and forge yourself in its fire. Stay curious, stay courageous, and stay awake.